Sir, are you telling me you own every one of these homes? The police officer asked the question twice because even he seemed unsure he had heard me correctly. I nodded. Behind him, the HOA president stood beside her folder with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already over. That man is refusing to comply with our association, she said. He has been warned. I looked at the officer and kept my voice calm. I am not in their HOA. The officer glanced at the map in her hands, then back at me. Then why are they claiming authority over you? I could have answered immediately, but I wanted the records to answer for me. I opened the folder I had brought from my truck. Inside were property records for several addresses throughout the neighborhood. The HOA president's expression tightened when she saw the documents. She had expected one homeowner standing alone. Instead, she was looking at records connected to 60 separate homes. My name was not listed directly on every document because the properties were held through my investment company, but the ownership structure was properly recorded. I had purchased the homes over several years, one property at a time, while the neighborhood was still expanding. I never needed to live in every house to own them. I rented many of them to families who wanted to stay in the area. I maintained the properties, paid the required taxes, and followed the recorded agreements attached to each parcel. What I had not agreed to was allowing an HOA to create new obligations simply because it believed every property nearby fell under its authority. The HOA president introduced herself as Karen Whitmore and insisted that the association had jurisdiction over the properties. She held up a subdivision map and pointed to a shaded section covering most of the neighborhood. These homes are within our community, she said. I asked her one question. Can you show me the recorded document that places my 60 properties under your authority? She hesitated. The officer noticed. Do you have that document? He asked her. Karen said the HOA had the map, governing documents, and enforcement records. The officer looked at me. Do you have proof of ownership? I handed him the folder. He reviewed the first few pages, then asked for the addresses. I gave him a printed list. His expression changed as he compared several addresses with the information Karen had provided. These are all connected to your company? He asked. Yes. Karen stepped forward and said the ownership structure did not matter because the homes were still subject to HOA rules. I answered quietly. Then we should look at the declaration. She immediately said the board had already reviewed it. That was the first detail that made me suspicious. If the declaration clearly settled the question, there should have been no reason to avoid showing it. The officer explained that he was not there to decide a property ownership dispute. He could document the complaint, but questions about deeds, covenants, and civil authority belonged in the proper legal process. Karen looked frustrated. She had called the police expecting them to make me comply. Instead, the officer was telling both of us that the records mattered. Before leaving, he asked Karen whether the HOA had verified that every property on its map was actually covered by the recorded declaration. She said yes. I looked at the folder in my hand. I knew that answer could be tested. And when I called my attorney that afternoon, he found something even more important than the 60 deeds. The HOA map Karen had used did not match the county records. The map was wrong, but that was not the most troubling part. Daniel Brooks, my attorney, had compared the HOA map with the county property records and found that several boundaries had been drawn differently. Michael, this is not just a bad copy, he said over the phone. The current HOA map places parcels inside the association that do not appear the same way in the recorded documents. I sat at my desk and pulled up the ownership records for all 60 homes. Every address had a separate file. Every deed had a recording number. Every property had a history. I asked Daniel to check the HOA declaration against those records one address at a time. He agreed. By late afternoon, he had identified the first major discrepancy. One of my homes was clearly identified as a separate parcel in the county records, yet the HOA map showed it inside the association's controlled area. I asked whether that alone changed the situation. Daniel said it did not automatically settle every obligation, because individual covenants could still apply to particular properties. But it meant we needed to examine the recorded declaration instead of relying on a neighborhood map. That distinction mattered. Karen had presented the map as if it were proof of authority. It was not. The next morning, Daniel sent me the original declaration. I read it carefully. The document described the subdivision boundaries and listed the properties included when the association was established. Several of my 60 homes were not listed in the same way Karen's map suggested. I called Daniel immediately. Why would their map show them differently? He said there were several possibilities, including a later amendment or mapping error. We need the recorded amendments, he said. I requested them from the county. While we waited, I contacted the property manager who handled several of my rentals. She told me Karen had recently asked whether my company intended to cooperate with a new community assessment. I had not heard anything about a new assessment. That was the first time I realized the police call might not have been the real objective. Karen had been trying to establish authority over my properties before something else happened. Daniel agreed. He asked me to find out whether the HOA had scheduled a board meeting. I checked the association website. There it was. A special meeting was scheduled for 72 hours later. The agenda included a proposed community assessment, a boundary review, and an enforcement policy update. I read the agenda twice. The timing was too precise to ignore. Karen had called the police, the map had been questioned, and now the board was preparing to vote on changes that could affect 60 properties I owned. Daniel told me not to accuse anyone until we had the records. Let the documents lead us, he said. I spent the next several hours organizing every deed, tax record, lease, and county filing connected to the homes. By evening, we had a working spreadsheet showing which properties appeared in the HOA declaration and which did not. Then Daniel called again. His voice was unusually serious. Michael, I found an old board communication. He emailed it to me. The message was from 2 years earlier. It contained a simple warning from the HOA's former attorney. Verify ownership and recorded boundaries before taking enforcement action. I read the sentence again. Karen had told the police that the HOA had already verified everything. But 2 years earlier, the HOA's own attorney had warned them not to do exactly what they were doing now. I asked Daniel who had received that warning. He gave me the names of several board members. Then he added one more detail. Karen was copied on the email. I looked at the special meeting notice on my screen. 72 hours remained. Whatever Karen wanted from my 60 homes, she had been planning it long before the police arrived. The warning from the former HOA attorney changed the way I looked at everything. Karen had been copied on that message 2 years earlier, yet she had told the police that the association had already verified its authority. I called Daniel and asked him to trace what happened after that warning. We need the meeting minutes, he said. If the board was told there was a boundary problem, the minutes should show what happened next. I requested every meeting record from that period and started reading them one by one. The first few were ordinary. Landscaping contracts, maintenance expenses, community events. Then I reached a meeting from 18 months earlier. A board member had asked whether properties outside the original subdivision could be included in future assessments. The answer from the HOA attorney was clear. Only properties covered by the recorded declaration could be assessed under the association's existing authority. I paused and called Daniel. Does this mean they knew? He said. It means they were advised. We still need to know what they did afterward. I kept reading. 3 months later, the board discussed updating the community map. The minutes described the change as an administrative correction. No recorded amendment was attached. No new declaration was referenced. The next meeting approved the updated map for internal use. That was the first moment I saw how the problem could have grown. A map created for convenience had slowly become something people treated like a legal document. Karen had relied on it. The police had been shown it. And now the board was preparing to use it as part of a new assessment. I asked Daniel whether the map itself could create obligations. He answered carefully. A map does not automatically change a recorded covenant. But people can make serious decisions based on a map if nobody checks the underlying records. That was exactly what seemed to have happened. I contacted my property manager and asked for copies of every HOA notice sent to my tenants during the previous year. She sent them that afternoon. Most were routine. Then I found one that made me stop. It announced a future assessment for road maintenance and community access improvements. The notice had been sent to several of my properties, even though the properties were not all identified the same way in the recorded declaration. I sent it to Daniel. He called within minutes. "This is important," he said. "Look at the effective date." The assessment was scheduled to begin immediately after the special meeting in 72 hours. That meant the timeline was becoming clearer. First, the HOA updated its internal map. Then it began sending assessment notices. Then it started enforcing rules against properties whose status was questionable. Finally, Karen called the police when I challenged the authority behind those actions. But there was still something missing. Why had the HOA suddenly become so interested in my 60 properties? Daniel searched the meeting minutes again and found a reference to a private development proposal. It involved improving access to an undeveloped section of the neighborhood. The proposal required cooperation from several property owners. One sentence listed my company as the largest ownership group affected by the proposed changes. I read it twice. 60 homes made me the largest single property owner in the community. Daniel explained that the proposal did not automatically give the HOA rights over my properties. But it explained why my cooperation mattered. I asked him whether Karen could use the HOA to pressure me into agreeing. He said, "Not lawfully beyond the authority granted by the recorded documents." That distinction was becoming the center of everything. I had no problem following legitimate rules. I had a problem with rules being created by assumption. Then Daniel found another document. It was an internal planning memorandum dated 6 months earlier, and it contained the first reference to a proposed access project with an estimated value of nearly $2 million. My company was listed beside one sentence. "Secure cooperation from primary property owner before public announcement." I looked at the 72-hour countdown on my calendar. Karen had not called the police because I was simply refusing an HOA rule. She had called because I had asked the one question that could delay an entire plan. And now I knew exactly where to look for the answer. The planning memorandum was the document I needed, but I knew better than to assume it told the whole story. I called Daniel and asked him to verify every name, date, and property reference before we made any accusation. "If this project is legitimate, the records should support it," he said. "If it is not, the records will show us where the problem begins." We started with the proposed access road. The memorandum described a new connection to the county highway that would improve traffic flow and increase access to undeveloped land beyond the current neighborhood. The estimated project value was nearly $2 million. My 60 properties were listed as the largest group of affected parcels. That explained why my cooperation mattered, but it did not explain why Karen had chosen enforcement instead of negotiation. Daniel requested the original project proposal. By the next morning, we had it. The proposal contained a section titled Property Coordination. Under it were several names of property owners, followed by a note beside my company. "Owner has not agreed." I stared at those 3 words. I had never been asked. Daniel said that was important because the HOA appeared to be treating my lack of agreement as an obstacle rather than a decision I was entitled to make. Then we found something even more revealing. The proposed road did not simply improve access to existing homes. It created a more direct route to a group of undeveloped lots owned by a private development company. If the project moved forward, those lots could become far more valuable. Daniel explained that this did not prove anyone had acted improperly. But it gave us a clear reason to investigate the timing. I asked when the developer first approached the HOA. The answer was 6 months before the planning memorandum. That was the same period when the internal map had been updated. The sequence was becoming difficult to ignore. The developer proposed an access project. The HOA updated its map. The association began preparing assessments. Then Karen contacted me about compliance. When I refused to accept authority I could not verify, she called the police. Daniel told me to keep the focus on documents. So I requested the board meeting minutes from the month the developer first approached the HOA. One entry stood out. Karen had told the board that the project could not proceed without cooperation from the primary property owner. The minutes did not identify me by name, but the reference to my company made the meaning clear. Another board member had asked whether the HOA had legal authority to require that cooperation. The response was recorded as, "Council will review." I called Daniel again. "Was that review ever completed?" He searched the records. "I do not see a completed opinion." That was a major problem. The HOA appeared to be moving forward with a project that depended on my cooperation without having a documented legal basis for compelling it. Then Daniel found an email from Karen to the board chair. It was dated 2 weeks before the police call. The message said, "We need the owner to acknowledge HOA authority before the special meeting." I read it slowly. She had not written that I needed to follow a specific recorded covenant. She wanted me to acknowledge the HOA's authority before the board voted on the new plan. That was very different. I asked Daniel what would happen if I refused. "Then they would need to rely on the actual governing documents," he said. "They cannot create authority simply by getting you to acknowledge it." I looked at the calendar. The special meeting was now less than 48 hours away. Karen had tried to settle the issue at my property, then called the police when I refused. But the documents suggested she needed something from me before the board meeting. She needed my acknowledgement. I suddenly understood why she had been so confident at the gate. If I had agreed to her claim before checking the records, the entire conversation could have looked very different. Daniel closed the file and said, "Now we need to find out exactly what they plan to put in front of the board." I nodded. The next document we requested was the draft resolution for the special meeting. And when it arrived, my name was on the first page. My name was on the first page of the draft resolution, but it was not listed as a property owner. It was listed under a section titled Required Cooperation. I read the paragraph twice before calling Daniel. "They want me to acknowledge that the HOA has authority over my properties before they vote on the assessment," I said. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he answered, "That is exactly what this document appears to say." The draft resolution proposed a new community assessment, a revised access policy, and an enforcement procedure covering properties identified on the current HOA map. My 60 homes were included. The language was careful. It did not say the HOA owned my properties. Instead, it assumed that the properties were already subject to the association's authority. Daniel pointed to the problem immediately. "They are using the disputed map as the foundation for the new resolution." I asked whether the board could vote on it anyway. He said the board could discuss and vote on matters within its lawful authority, but the resolution could not create property rights that were never granted in the recorded documents. I printed the draft and placed it beside the original declaration. The differences were becoming impossible to ignore. The declaration described the original subdivision boundaries. The new resolution relied on a map created years later. The map included several parcels differently from the original records. And now the HOA wanted my written acknowledgement before the board meeting. I called Karen. She answered immediately. "Have you reviewed the resolution?" she asked. "Yes." "Then you understand what we need from you." I asked her to explain why my acknowledgement was required. She said the board needed certainty before approving the access project. "Certainty about what?" I asked. "Your relationship to the community." I told her my relationship was simple. I owned the properties. I would follow any valid recorded obligations attached to them. I would not sign a document acknowledging authority that I had not verified. Karen's voice became noticeably colder. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," I replied. "I am asking you to show me the document that gives the HOA the authority you are asking me to acknowledge." She did not provide one. Instead, she said the board would address the matter at the special meeting. After the call ended, Daniel sent me another message. He had found the original HOA declaration and several amendments that had never been included in the current association map. One amendment actually excluded a group of parcels from a particular community obligation. 2 of those parcels were among my properties. That was the first concrete evidence that the current map was not merely outdated. It could materially change how the recorded documents were understood. I asked Daniel to prepare a complete comparison for the board. He agreed. Then he found something else. A draft version of the special meeting agenda had been changed the night before. The original agenda contained only the assessment and access project. The revised version added a new item called confirmation of community property jurisdiction. My name was referenced again. Daniel said the timing was important. Karen was trying to get the board to formally approve the disputed jurisdiction before anyone outside the HOA reviewed the records. I looked at the clock. Less than 24 hours remained before the meeting. I had spent the entire day collecting documents, but now I knew exactly what was at stake. If the board approved that resolution using the disputed map, it could create an entirely new dispute over my 60 properties. Daniel told me not to sign anything. Bring the original records and let the board compare them, he said. I agreed. Then, just before midnight, an email arrived from the HOA office. It contained the final resolution. One sentence had been added after our phone call. It stated that any owner refusing to acknowledge HOA jurisdiction could be referred for immediate enforcement review. I read the sentence slowly. Karen had just given me the clearest reason yet to attend that meeting. She wanted my acknowledgement. I was going to bring her the records instead. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I had 3 folders packed, a digital copy of every major record, and one simple decision: I would let the documents speak for themselves. The special meeting was scheduled for that evening, and Karen had already circulated the final resolution to the board. I arrived at the clubhouse with Daniel just before the meeting began. Several homeowners were already seated, along with the HOA board members. Karen stood at the front of the room beside a large display showing the current community map. She looked confident again. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Tonight we are going to establish clear authority over properties that have caused repeated confusion." I listened without interrupting. Then she displayed the map. My 60 properties were shaded as part of the HOA jurisdiction. A few homeowners nodded because they had seen the map many times before. Karen explained that the proposed resolution would confirm the association's authority and allow the board to proceed with the community assessment and access improvements. Then she said my name. "The primary property owner has refused to acknowledge the association's jurisdiction." I stood and asked one question. "May I see the recorded documents supporting that jurisdiction?" Karen said the board had the governing documents. I placed my first folder on the table. "Then we can compare them." Daniel opened the original declaration. He showed the board the recorded subdivision boundaries. Then he placed the current HOA map beside it. The difference was immediately visible. One board member leaned forward. "Why are these boundaries different?" Karen said the map had been updated for administrative purposes. Daniel answered calmly. "Administrative mapping does not automatically amend a recorded declaration." Karen objected that the map had been used for years. I replied, "That does not make it a transfer document." The room became quieter. Then Daniel opened the amendments that Karen's current map did not include. One amendment excluded several parcels from a specific community obligation. 2 of those parcels were mine. A board member asked why the current map did not reflect the amendment. Karen said the mapping department may have missed it. Daniel asked who approved the map. She said she would need to check the records. I could feel the room changing. The issue was no longer one homeowner refusing to cooperate. The board was being asked to approve a resolution based on a map that did not fully match its own recorded documents. Then I placed the 60 property ownership summary on the table. I explained that I was not claiming every one of my properties was exempt from every HOA obligation. I was asking the board to determine exactly which covenants applied to which parcels. That distinction mattered. One board member thanked me for making it clear. Karen looked frustrated and said the association could not function if every owner challenged its authority. I answered, I am not challenging legitimate authority. I am asking you to prove it before you enforce it. Daniel then opened the old warning from the former HOA attorney. He read the sentence advising the board to verify ownership and boundaries before taking enforcement action. Several board members recognized the email. One of them asked Karen whether she had received it. She admitted that she had been copied. The board chair looked at the final resolution. Then why does this document say the jurisdiction is already established? Karen did not answer immediately. Finally, she said the association had relied on its established records. Daniel replied, That is precisely what we are reviewing tonight. Then a board member raised another issue. He had found the developer's original access proposal in the HOA archive. The document showed that the proposed road project depended on cooperation from the primary property owner. He looked at me. Is that you? I nodded. Karen's expression changed. The board chair asked why that requirement had not been disclosed before the enforcement action. No one answered. Then Daniel opened the last page of the proposal. A handwritten note appeared beneath the ownership section. Do not proceed without owner cooperation. I looked at Karen. The police call, the disputed map, the resolution, and the sudden deadline were beginning to form one connected story. But there was still one question nobody in that room had answered. Who had decided that refusing to cooperate meant the HOA could call the police? The police call did not come from Karen alone. Daniel's words stopped me before I could close the folder. The special meeting had exposed the disputed map, the missing legal review, and the developer's demand for my cooperation, but now we had a new question. Who had authorized the attempt to pressure me through law enforcement? Daniel had obtained the original complaint record from the police department. It listed Karen as the reporting party, but the attached correspondence contained something unexpected. Before the call was placed, Karen had exchanged emails with the HOA board chair and an outside consultant connected to the Access project. The consultant had advised the board that a police response might clarify the owner's position. I read the sentence twice. Daniel pointed to the timestamp. The message was sent 30 minutes before Karen arrived at my property. That meant the police call was not an impulsive reaction to a disagreement. It had been discussed in advance. I asked Daniel to find out who the consultant was. He traced the name to a development company that stood to benefit from the proposed access road. The connection was now direct enough to demand answers, but I still wanted proof that the board understood what it was doing. We returned to the meeting records. The board had recessed after the disputed resolution was challenged, and several members were now reviewing the documents independently. One board member, Susan Miller, approached me privately. I owe you an apology, she said. I thought the map was based on the recorded declaration. She explained that Karen had presented the map repeatedly as the definitive boundary record. Susan had never seen the older amendments. Then she handed me a copy of an email she had received that morning. It came from Karen and instructed board members not to distribute the original declaration until after the vote. I asked why. Susan shook her head. She said the older documents would create unnecessary confusion. That sentence changed everything. The problem was no longer just a mistaken map. Someone had deliberately controlled which documents the board members saw before making a decision. Daniel immediately asked for the full communication history. Within an hour, we found another message from the developer's consultant. It stated that the Access project needed the board to resolve ownership resistance before the public announcement. My company was identified as the primary obstacle. The phrase sounded harmless until we compared it with the timeline. First came the developer's proposal. Then the map changed. Then the assessment was prepared. Then Karen demanded my acknowledgement. When I refused, the police were called. Now we had a documented sequence connecting every step. But the biggest surprise came from Susan. She had discovered that the proposed access route crossed a small strip of land belonging to one of my 60 properties. It was only 20 feet wide, but without that strip, the planned connection could not be completed as designed. That was why my cooperation mattered. They did not simply want me to accept HOA authority. They needed me to give permission for a project that could significantly increase the value of the developers' surrounding land. I asked Daniel whether the HOA had any right to approve that transfer without my consent. He answered carefully. Not based on what we have seen. Then Susan revealed one final detail. The board had been told the project would lose its financing if the access plan was delayed beyond the next 48 hours. That explained the urgency. The countdown was not about the HOA at all. It was about the developer's financing deadline. Karen had been trying to force certainty before the money disappeared. I looked across the meeting room at her. For the first time, she was no longer speaking with confidence. The board chair asked her one question. Did you know the developer needed this property owner's cooperation? Karen hesitated. Then she admitted she did. The room fell silent. Daniel placed the police complaint beside the developer's proposal. The dates matched almost perfectly. Then he opened the final email. It contained one sentence that made every previous event look different. Once the owner acknowledges HOA jurisdiction, proceed with the access agreement. I finally understood what Karen had been trying to obtain. She did not need me to obey the HOA. She needed me to sign away a position I had never been required to surrender. And now the board had to decide whether it would approve a plan built on that assumption before the 48-hour deadline expired. The 48-hour deadline was no longer a rumor. The developer's financing depended on the access agreement, and the access agreement depended on my cooperation. But there was one problem nobody had planned for. I had never agreed to give anyone permission to use the 20-foot strip of land connected to one of my properties. Daniel told me to stay calm and let the board decide what it wanted to do with the evidence. The meeting resumed with every board member holding copies of the original declaration, the older amendments, and the developer's proposal. Karen sat at the front table with a much quieter expression than she had worn earlier. The board chair asked her whether the association had ever received written permission from me to use the property for the proposed access route. Karen said the project was still in the planning stage. Susan immediately asked why the draft resolution described my cooperation as something the HOA could require. Karen did not answer directly. Instead, she said the association needed a practical solution because the community would benefit from the project. I stood and explained that I was not opposed to improving the neighborhood. I was opposed to being told that I had already granted a right I had never granted. That distinction mattered to several homeowners in the room. One asked whether the proposed assessment would apply to properties that were not clearly covered by the recorded declaration. Daniel answered that the board needed a parcel-by-parcel legal review before making that determination. Then he presented the original map and the current HOA map side by side. The differences were clear. Several parcels had shifted into the HOA's claimed area without a corresponding recorded amendment. The board chair asked Karen why the association had not obtained an updated legal opinion before preparing the resolution. Karen said the board had relied on its existing records. Susan responded, "But we now know those records are inconsistent." That sentence changed the mood in the room. The board could no longer treat the problem as a disagreement between Karen and me. It had become a documentation issue affecting multiple property owners. Then Daniel presented the internal email showing that Karen had been copied on the warning from the former HOA attorney. He followed it with the email instructing board members not to distribute the older declaration before the vote. Karen finally admitted that she believed the older documents would complicate the meeting. The board chair asked whether she had intentionally withheld them. Karen said she had only wanted to avoid confusion. Daniel calmly replied that confusion was precisely why the original records needed to be reviewed. Then the developer's consultant joined the meeting by phone. He explained that the financing deadline was real, but he denied pressuring the HOA to force my cooperation. Susan asked why the consultant had described my company as the primary obstacle. He said the project could not proceed without access through the 20-foot strip. I looked at Daniel. He nodded. That confirmed what we had suspected. The project was not simply about community improvements. My property was a necessary piece of the plan. The board chair then made an unexpected proposal. He moved to suspend the new assessment and postpone the jurisdiction resolution until an independent property attorney could review the declaration, amendments, maps, and proposed access agreement. Karen objected, saying the delay could cost the community its opportunity. The board chair answered, "An opportunity built on disputed authority is not an opportunity we should approve tonight." The motion passed. Karen's plan had stopped without anyone raising their voice. But before the meeting ended, the developer's consultant sent one final document to the board. It was the draft access agreement. I expected to see a request for permission to use my property. Instead, the first page contained language stating that the HOA had already established authority over the affected parcels. Daniel read it carefully and looked at me. "This agreement assumes the exact point we are disputing." Then he turned to the board. "If this document is signed, the dispute becomes much larger." The board chair placed it on the table and asked everyone to remain seated. The deadline had not disappeared. The financing decision was still less than 24 hours away. And now the board had to choose between protecting the project and correcting the records before signing anything that could change the rights attached to 60 homes. The board had less than 24 hours to decide, but for the first time, the pressure was no longer on me. It was on the records. The independent property attorney reviewed the original declaration, every recorded amendment, the current HOA map, and the proposed access agreement. Daniel and I waited while the board members reviewed the same documents. Then the attorney gave his conclusion. The HOA had authority over the properties covered by its recorded declaration, but the current map could not expand that authority by itself. Several of my 60 properties required individual review because their recorded status did not match the map being used by the association. Most importantly, the 20-foot strip needed for the access project could not be treated as community property without a valid recorded right or my permission. The board chair asked whether the proposed resolution could be approved as written. The attorney said no. The language needed to be changed. The assessment also needed to be reviewed before being applied to parcels whose status had not been established. Karen asked whether delaying the project would create a problem with the developer. The attorney answered that the developer's financing deadline was a business matter, not a reason to bypass property records. That statement settled the issue. The board voted to suspend the disputed resolution, withdraw the enforcement language directed at my properties, and commission a complete parcel-by-parcel review. The access agreement was rejected in its current form because it assumed authority that had not been established. The developer was notified that the project could not proceed on that assumption. Then the board addressed the police complaint. The chair acknowledged that the matter should have been treated as a civil property dispute from the beginning. The police report remained part of the record, but the HOA could no longer use it as evidence that I had violated a confirmed association requirement. Karen sat quietly as the board reviewed the timeline. The police call, the disputed map, the withheld declaration, the proposed assessment, and the access agreement had all been connected by one assumption, that the HOA already had authority over every property shown on its map. Once the original records were placed beside that map, the assumption fell apart. Susan made one final motion. She asked the board to require that all future enforcement actions involving property boundaries be verified against the recorded documents before notices were issued. The motion passed unanimously. Then she looked at me. "I am sorry we did not check sooner." I told her I appreciated the correction. I had never wanted the HOA to disappear. I wanted it to follow the same rules it expected everyone else to follow. Karen eventually approached me after the meeting. She did not apologize for everything, but she acknowledged one important point. "We should have checked the records first," she said. I agreed. Daniel collected the folders and closed the final file. 60 homes remained in my portfolio. The HOA remained in the neighborhood. The access project was not necessarily dead, but it would have to be redesigned around actual property rights and voluntary agreements. The developer lost its original timeline, but the community had avoided approving a document built on disputed authority. As I drove home, I thought about how close the entire situation had come to becoming something much larger. The HOA had assumed a map was enough. Karen had assumed a police call would settle the argument. The developer had assumed my cooperation could be obtained through pressure. None of those assumptions survived contact with the original records. I never needed to threaten anyone. I never needed to raise my voice. I only needed to ask for the document that proved what they claimed. And that was the lesson I took from the entire experience. When someone insists they have authority over your property, the most powerful question is often the simplest one. Show me where it is written.